finally, today we have Alvin Finkel, who is recently retired from Athabasca University. He was the longtime book review editor of Labour Le Travail, and he has written widely on Canadian and Prairie labor and social history. And he will be giving us today some reflections on the recent elections.
Thanks, Christine. So, first of all, it's ironic to be talking about the Canadian elections at a conference honoring the career of Brian Palmer. Brian doesn't vote, and you may be right in not voting.
That's not true.
You voted once, you said, right?
No, that's a different story. To my shame, I once voted for the NDP. I destroy my ballot or refuse.
Okay, well, many of us do this regularly. So. But this follows on really in what Marcel was telling us about, the decline of social democracy and its identity, but also on what Stephanie was telling us about, in terms of what you teach in labor studies versus what was talked about in this election. In terms of social class in this election, the only class that we heard about was the middle class, who we were told was kind of disappearing. There was nothing suggesting that there's capital and there's labor in our society, or employer and employees, or if they're there, that there's any conflicts between them. And for me, a kind of defining moment during the election was during the economics debate that occurred during the election. The Globe and Mail editor asked, it sounded like an innocuous enough question, and said, to the three leaders, well, many young people find, this is similar to what Stephanie was talking about, that many young people find that, it's very hard to feel any economic security. The job market seems to be changing so much, and they worry about what their futures are. So what do you say to them? Well, Stephen Harper said what you would expect, which is, well, I've been cutting taxes like crazy, and so the corporations will invest, so they have nothing to worry about. And then Justin Trudeau said, something in terms of his middle class tax cut or something, so reverted to his standard lines during the election. And then it came to Thomas Mulcair, and he did much the same thing. He referred to something that was I think the strongest point in the NDP platform, which was the promise of $15 a day universal daycare. But frankly, what did this have to do with the question that was being asked? And the point is that all three of these guys pretty much equally accept the whole neoliberal premise that governments don't have a role to play in the economy, that they don't have the responsibility to represent the electorate, the majority of them are working class people, and to direct the economy, that's the job of the private sector. Once you accept that, of course, it's very hard for social democracy or anybody else to have a particular identity. So the election really then revolved around the question of, well, who's the kind of nicer leader? And Tom Mulcair is not somebody who presented himself as a particularly nice man. Again, you have this kind of acting out of different things. This is a guy who's in a way he's a pit bull, and probably would have been pretty good as a pit bull during the election, but instead they decided to frame him as this grandfatherly guy, and he actually, to me, looked comatose. So I'm not surprised that not very many people liked him. Justin Trudeau, by contrast, although he's not very bright and he didn't have a whole lot to say, sounded very passionate as he said nothing, and reflected people's real anger with our outgoing Prime Minister. Was a horrible person. In a sense, quite apart from the question of what governments do and what they don't do, we've kind of gone through a decade where we were kind of like the abusive, living with an abusive partner. We had a prime minister who seemed to go after everything in the country. Ran the election on attacking Muslims essentially, and and has for years been trying to create the same law and order bullshit that's created this kind of prison industrial complex in the States, and muzzling scientists so they can't speak for the environment, all of this kind of stuff. So so in terms of that, I mean, we're rid of the guy, and so I guess in a way we should be happy, at least that Canadians will put up with a lot, but not that much. But that still doesn't excuse the fact that we didn't have a real discussion of very much about people's lives, people's day-to-day lives. So in terms of the answers that the three leaders gave to the question about the economy in particular, and focusing on Mulcair, who should have had more to say, where's the precariat that Stephanie was talking about? I mean, we know that, there were recent figures that in Toronto, our largest city, 50% of everybody doesn't have a real employer. They're just kind of going from part-time job to part-time job. Even a lot of the ones who do have employers are not full-time. So, we not only don't have, the Fordist agreement of the post-war period, we have no notion of stability for people. At least at the end of the war, there were debates on the question of how to provide full employment. Now, of course, it was full employment within a capitalist system, and the notion was that jobs would still largely be created, through the private sector, but there was a notion that state policies were going to play an important role in terms of trying to direct that sector. A lot of the stuff that was discussed was in many ways illusion, but it's still, there was this notion that to placate working people, to prevent them from making a revolution or whatever, that you had to assure them you weren't going back to the Great Depression. You weren't going to let them, have no source of income. So there would be jobs, there would be social programs, etc., etc. That now is largely gone. The daycare promise being a bit of an exception in this. So what kinds of things were discussed in the election? Actually, I thought it was interesting at the very end of the election, at a point where nobody was listening to him anymore. Thomas Mulcair talked about, this was at a rally I attended in Edmonton, and he said, Medicare, Pharmacare, daycare, Mulcair. But the fact of the matter is, he actually didn't promise Pharmacare. If you read the platform, they were going to do something that was going to lower drug costs a little bit. And I think over 8 years or 12 years or whatever, there was going to be Pharmacare. And the daycare, which, at the beginning of the election, I thought, he's promising, a daycare program as soon as it's physically possible. But it turned out he was promising a daycare program when it was physically possible, because he wasn't willing to raise more money, from through corporate tax. Well, he was going to raise the corporate tax by 2%. From 15% to 70%, which would actually put it 5% behind where it was when Stephen Harper came to office, and 12% behind what it was just back to 2000. I can remember, I think most of the people in this room will remember, when the corporate tax in this country was 40%, and capitalists still did very well. But under neoliberalism, because the capitalist system seemed to be failing after the early 1970s, instead of a notion being that we should weaken that system, take it over, the notion became, well, no, you have to give them more. Then they'll have the incentives. that hasn't worked, so the notion is to give them everything. The only time in the election where a little bit of sort of class stuff came out was in the discussion about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where, Harper was announcing yet another trade agreement that's likely to cost Canadian jobs. And so Mulcair did express some disagreement with it, but I don't think he had any credibility at that point. It did allow him to keep the 2 Windsor seats, I noticed, but really overall, he wasn't saying anything that would resonate with people. And ironically, all he would have to have said to sound radical, all anybody would have had to have said to sound radical, is that they were going back to the revenue regime that we had just before Harper got in. You don't have to go any further back than that. $50 billion has been taken out of federal revenue. And so, of course, the ability of the Canadian state to do very much has been affected. And so how much of that was Mulcair going to take back? Being most generous, about $7.5 billion. Trudeau about $4 billion. So it's nothing. And so the capacity of the Canadian state to do very much has been, was weakened by Harper, which he saw as his role. And the opposition leaders attacked him for that in a way, but basically came up with policies that wouldn't change it. Another thing is Mulcair talked about the 400,000 manufacturing jobs that had been lost during the Harper period. Well, that was a good point. I heard nothing about what he thought he was going to do to get those jobs back or replace them with other jobs. There was talk about the environment during the election. Nothing about workers in terms of this. What's the impact of trying to improve our environmental policy, which of course we should do. But what exactly was this going to mean for workers? That seemed to be like a non-issue. What about also, in terms of that $50 billion, nobody talked about, and maybe it's an embarrassment to talk about it, all the government workers have lost their jobs in this country. And in many cases, it's not because what they were doing is no longer being done, it's because their jobs have been intensified. And so, for example, I don't know about others and their experiences with government offices, but in the last several years, I've had to deal with the Department of Immigration. I've had to deal with the Canada Revenue Agency. You can't talk to anybody. The people there are just so busy and so stressed. It's just impossible for them to get their work done. Nobody was talking about replacing those jobs. Nobody was talking about quality of jobs, at least in the area that the federal government can most control, which is its own workers. The one promise that Mulcair made in terms of people who are in federally regulated industries was that he would increase the federal minimum wage to $15. And Trudeau, who seemed to get away with this, said, well, there are, millions of people in this country making less than this $15 minimum wage that you're talking about, and they aren't going to be affected by this. Well, obviously they're not, because the federal government doesn't control their wages. But here would be this example to be pushed on the provinces. But again, it just didn't sound like something sincere. One of the things that Trudeau said that Mulcair didn't really go after very much of what Trudeau said, except sometimes to kind of carp on certain things. But in the very first debate, when they were talking about Mulcair's tiny little increase in the corporate tax from 15% to 17%, and Trudeau was asked, why he wasn't going to increase the corporate tax. And he said, well, there are people who love to hate corporations, and I'm not one of them. Well, how do you let somebody get away with something like that? Well, you do it because Mulcair, the NDP, had decided they wanted to present themselves as this cautious party nobody had to be afraid of. And not only were they cautious, but they were pre-Keynesian. They actually weren't willing to run a deficit. Now, where did that come from? And that seemed to raise a question to me too, like, well, who are these people, this NDP, and who decides their policies? I don't think any of their members are opposed to deficit. And what about the unions that built the NDP? Why were they allowing this kind of stuff? And what, I mean, it's been going on for a while. This isn't the first election where the NDP, claimed that they wouldn't run deficits. Nor would they take back the money that had been taken out of the economy. So anyway, overall, in terms of this election, the injuries of class, the potential of individual workers and collective workers to be able to plan their futures, the kinds of demands of the civil society movements, First Nations, of immigrants, none of this really played a role. So, it's an quote opportunity missed, but then putting it in the larger framework of what Marcel presented, it does reflect on the international state of social democracy and of the trade union movement.